The London rain never brought a sense of cleansing. It only coated the city in a slimy, grey, and frigid shroud. To Eleanor Vane, the raindrops drumming against the stained glass windows of the Vane Manor sounded like the knocking of a grim reaper. The Vane estate sat isolated behind iron fences that curved like thorns, a fortress of wealth built on a foundation of fear and blood. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and cigar smoke. Elena stood in the second-floor hallway, her slender frame swallowed by the shadows. She held her breath, her keen ears straining to catch the voices drifting from behind the intricately carved oak doors of her father's study. Julian Vane was a man with a low, commanding voice, the kind of voice that could make even the bravest men tremble. But tonight, there was a cold exhilaration in his tone. "The deal is done," Julian said, followed by the sharp clink of crystal glasses. "Volkov will receive the northern shipping routes. In exchange, he will ensure absolute loyalty to us." "And the price, Mr. Vane?" a strange, guttural voice asked. It was Victor, the right hand of the brutal Russian kingpin, Volkov. Julian laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "My daughter, Eleanor. She is the most precious rose in this garden. A marriage to bind two empires. It is a small price to pay for absolute dominance, is it not?" Eleanor felt her heart stop. The world around her began to spin. She wasn't a daughter. She was a commodity, a line on a balance sheet, a toy for her father to barter for power. Volkov was not a husband. He was a notorious tyrant with sadistic appetites. Marrying him was a prolonged death sentence. She didn't cry. Tears had been scorched dry in this house long ago. She retreated silently, her bare feet making no sound on the fur rug. In Elena's head, an invisible clock began to tick. She returned to her bedroom, a magnificent gilded cage with damask-covered walls and Louis XIV furniture. Elena locked the door, her hands shaking, but her mind eerily clear. She had been preparing for this moment for 2 years, ever since she saw the bruises on her mother's arms before she disappeared, mysteriously. Beneath a loose floorboard under the wardrobe, Elena pulled out a worn black leather bag. Inside was everything she needed for a new life. A fake passport in the name of Lena Miller, made by an information broker she'd secretly contacted on the dark web, several stacks of cash in various currencies, and a small, palm-sized pistol. Elena stepped into the bathroom. She looked into the mirror. The face reflecting back was beautiful. Deep, sea-blue eyes and golden hair that flowed to her waist. It was the face her father took pride in presenting to partners, and the face she now hated most. She picked up a pair of sharp scissors. Snip. The long, golden locks fell to the floor like broken silk. She hacked at it until it was short and jagged, then used a cheap bottle of dye from a pharmacy to turn it a dull, unremarkable, mousy brown. When she looked in the mirror again, Elena Vane was gone. In her place was an ordinary, tired girl, the kind you would never glance at twice on the street. "Goodbye, Elena," she whispered. Midnight. The mansion sank into a deceptive silence. Security teams patrolled the grounds every 15 minutes. Eleanor knew their schedule by heart. She didn't use the main door or the balcony. She climbed into the ventilation shaft of the old heating system, a cramped, dusty path she had discovered as a lonely child. The space was dark and suffocating. Elena's heartbeat thundered in her chest like a war drum. She crawled on elbows and knees, feeling the cold metal press against her skin. After an eternity, she reached the exhaust vent behind the kitchen, near the manor's trash disposal. The rain was still heavy. Eleanor bolted from the door, the darkness swallowing her. She didn't head for the main gate. Instead, she moved toward the eastern stone wall, where a small gap was hidden by a thicket of thorny briars. The thorns clawed at her smooth skin, but Eleanor felt no pain. The pain of freedom is always sweeter than the safety of chains. Reaching the main road, she didn't call a taxi immediately. She walked for over 2 miles in the downpour, letting the rain wash away the lingering scent of her expensive perfume. At a remote gas station, she used a payphone to call an unregistered motorcycle service. "Victoria Station," she said curtly. At the station, the midnight bustle of London helped her blend in. Tired commuters, drunks, the homeless. She was one of them. She bought a train ticket to Paris, from where she would take a bus to Zurich, and finally, Geneva. A convoluted route to erase her tracks. As the train began to move, Elena looked through the steam-fogged window. The Vane Manor and her father's silhouette faded into the night. She knew that tomorrow, when Julian Vane discovered his merchandise was missing, he would tear Europe apart to find her. She knew Volkov would see this as an insult and demand blood as compensation. Elena clutched her bag to her chest. She was no longer the Vane heiress. She had no wealth, no protection, no predetermined future. She had only herself, a fake name, and a terrifying fear. But as the train accelerated past the London suburbs, Elena felt, for the first time in years, that she could breathe. That breath, though cold with the taste of rain and coal smoke, belonged to her. The escape had only just begun. Ahead of her lay the misty Alps, the secretive Swiss banks, and a shadow waiting for her in the stillness of Geneva. A man named Dante Moretti, who she did not yet know was her cruel destiny and her only salvation. Tonight, Elena Vane died, and from the ashes of betrayal, Lena Miller took her first steps into the dark. The city of Geneva did not welcome strangers. It merely tolerated them. It was a city of sterile precision, of ticking watch gears and hushed bank vaults, a place where neutrality was a religion, and silence was the currency of the elite. For Eleanor Vane, now Lena Miller, it was the perfect purgatory. 6 months had passed since the midnight train had carried her away from the jagged silhouette of London. In that time, the vibrant, defiant Elena had been methodically buried under layers of drab wool and calculated invisibility. She had become a ghost in a city of shadows, moving through the cobblestone streets of the old town like a smudge on a lens. The architecture of invisibility. Lena's morning routine was a ritual of survival. She woke up at 5:30 a.m. in a cramped attic apartment on Rue de la Tertasse. The room was small, smelling of old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of the radiator. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal trinkets. Nothing that could link her to the girl who once wore diamonds and silk. She dressed in the dark, a thick, charcoal-coloured turtleneck, loose-fitting trousers, and a heavy pea coat that swallowed her frame. She looked in the mirror, but she didn't see herself. She saw a dull, brown-haired woman with tired eyes. The dye had taken its toll on her hair, leaving it brittle, but it served its purpose. She was the woman no one remembered. By 7 a.m., she was at her desk at Les Archives de l'Ancien. It was a dusty, basement-level firm that specialized in translating and digitizing centuries-old legal documents for private estates. Her boss, Monsieur Durand, was a man who appreciated 2 things: punctuality and silence. He never asked why a woman with her intellect was content to spend 10 hours a day in a windowless room deciphering 18th-century French land deeds. In Geneva, everyone had something they weren't talking about. "Morning, Lena," Durand grunted, not looking up from his ledger. "Morning, monsieur," she replied, her voice a practiced flat monotone. She spent the next 8 hours submerged in the past. It was safer there. In the 1700s, there were no Vane syndicates, no Volkov alliances, and no fathers who sold their daughters like livestock. She worked with a frantic kind of focus, using the drudgery to drown out the voice in her head that screamed every time a door slammed too hard or a black car lingered too long at a red light. The prickle of paranoia. Paranoia was not a feeling. It was a physical weight. It sat on her chest as she walked home, a cold pressure that made her lungs feel tight. Elena had been trained from birth to spot a tail. It was the only useful thing her father had ever taught her. As she crossed the Pont des Berges, the wind off Lake Geneva whipped at her face, carrying the bite of the coming winter. She stopped at a stone parapet, ostensibly to watch the famous jet d'eau fountain spraying into the grey sky. In reality, she was using the reflection in a nearby shop window to scan the crowd behind her. There, a black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows. It was parked illegally near the Four Seasons. It had been there yesterday and the day before. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Is it him? Did the Volkovs find me? She forced herself to breathe. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She couldn't run. Running attracted attention. A ghost doesn't run. A ghost fades. She turned into a narrow alleyway, doubling back through a crowded chocolate shop to lose any potential follower. She spent an hour sitting in the back of a cathedral, her head bowed as if in prayer, though she was only praying for the sun to go down. The weight of silence. By 6 p.m., the hunger for human contact usually began to gnaw at her. It was the most dangerous part of her day. The isolation was a shield, but it was also a poison. She missed the sound of laughter. She missed the feel of a silk dress against her skin. Most of all, she missed the girl she used to be, the one who believed she could change the world instead of just hiding from it. To stave off the madness, she went to the library. The Bibliothèque de Genève was her sanctuary. It was a sprawling labyrinth of knowledge where she could disappear between the stacks. She spent her evenings reading about architecture, the grand cathedrals of Italy, the sleek skyscrapers of New York. She dreamed of building things that were permanent, things that couldn't be torn down by a man's greed. Tonight, however, the books offered no solace. The feeling of being watched had intensified into a physical itch at the base of her neck. She left the library and began to walk. She didn't head home. Home was a trap. Instead, she wandered toward the lakefront, where the luxury hotels stood like monuments to the life she had abandoned. The lights of the hotels reflected in the dark water of the lake, shimmering like broken glass. The Black Sea. She found herself standing near the docks, watching the private yachts bobbing in the swells. They reminded her of the Mediterranean summers of her youth, the smell of salt air, the taste of champagne, the illusion of safety. "The water is colder than it looks," a voice said. Elena nearly jumped out of her skin. She spun around, her hand instinctively reaching into her coat pocket for the small pistol she always carried. A man stood several feet away, leaning against a lamppost. He was tall, dressed in an expensive dark overcoat that looked like it cost more than her apartment. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and even in the dim light, his eyes were a startling, piercing green. He didn't look like a hunter. He looked like a king. "I wasn't planning on going in," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The man stepped forward, moving with a predatory grace that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Good. It would be a waste. You've worked so hard to stay alive, Lena Miller." The use of her alias hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, her back hitting the cold iron railing of the dock. "I don't know who you are." "You don't," he agreed, his voice a low, smooth velvet. "But I know who you are. I know about the train from London. I know about the apartment on Rue de la Tertasse. And I know about the men your father sent to find you. Eleanor's vision blurred. The world was tilting. This is it. It's over. Who sent you? Volkov? The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a cold, sharp sound. Volkov couldn't find his own feet in a dark room. No, Elena, I wasn't sent by anyone. He stepped into the circle of light cast by the lamppost. The light hit the sharp angles of his face, the scar that ran just below his jawline, and the insignia on his cufflink, a serpent entwined around a dagger. The Moretti crest. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. The Morettis were the Vane's oldest rivals, a bloodline of Mediterranean lords who had been at war with her father for 3 generations. If the Vanes were the scalpel, the Morettis were the sledgehammer. Dante Moretti, she whispered. In the flesh, he replied. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching a stray lock of her mousy brown hair. You did a terrible job with the colour. You were meant for gold, not ash. The choice in the cold. Elena felt the cold metal of her pistol in her pocket, but she knew it was useless. A man like Dante didn't walk up to a Vane alone unless he already owned the street. She looked around. The docks were empty, the tourists gone, the only sound the rhythmic slapping of the water against the wood. Are you going to kill me? She asked, her voice regaining some of its old Vane steel. Or are you going to sell me back to my father? Dante leaned closer, his scent, cedarwood, rain, and something dangerously metallic, filling her senses. Your father thinks you're a pawn. Volkov thinks you're a prize. I think you're a ghost who's forgotten how to haunt. He pulled a small silver coin from his pocket and flipped it into the air, catching it effortlessly. I'm not going to kill you, Elena, and I'm certainly not giving you back to Julian. I have a much more interesting use for you. I'm not a tool for your games, Dante. Aren't you? He tilted his head. You've spent 6 months hiding in a basement, erasing yourself. You aren't living. You're just waiting to be caught. I'm offering you a way out. A real way out. At what price? Dante stepped back, the darkness reclaiming him. The price is your ghost. Kill the girl who hides. Bring back the girl who fights. My car is at the end of the pier. You can walk back to your attic and wait for your father's men. They'll be there by midnight, by the way. Or you can get in the car. He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and began to walk away, his silhouette blending into the fog. Eleanor stood frozen on the dock. The wind screamed across the lake, biting through her thin coat. She looked back toward the city, toward the tiny attic room where she had tried to build a life out of nothing. She thought of the black Mercedes, the clicking clocks, and the smell of her father's cigars. She looked at the end of the pier. The tail lights of a car glowed like embers in the mist. She had spent her whole life running from monsters. She had never considered what would happen if she ran with one. Elena Vane took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her throat. She didn't look back at the city. She didn't look at the water. She walked towards the embers. The ghost of Geneva was dead. Something far more dangerous was about to be born. The blizzard that descended upon Geneva that evening was not merely a storm. It was a white apocalypse. It swept down from the Jura Mountains with a primal ferocity, turning the city's disciplined streets into a chaotic labyrinth of ice and blinding sleet. The wind howled through the narrow crevices of the old town, sounding like the screams of the damned, and the great lake groaned under the weight of the freezing gale. For Lena, the woman who had once been Eleanor Vane, the weather was a physical manifestation of her own internal state. She was numb, battered, and utterly lost. She had not gotten into Dante Moretti's car the night before. At the last second, the ingrained instinct to distrust any man with a name as heavy as Moretti had won. She had vanished into the shadows of the docks, doubling back through the winding alleys of the Basse Ville until she was certain she wasn't being followed. But Dante's parting words had haunted her like a curse. They'll be there by midnight. He hadn't been lying. She had watched from a safe distance, huddled in the freezing doorway of a closed bakery, as three men in heavy wool coats, men with the unmistakable broad-shouldered gait of Volkov's enforcers, had smashed through the door of her apartment on Rue de la Tertasse. They had emerged 20 minutes later, their faces twisted in frustration, carrying the few meagre belongings she had left behind. She was truly a ghost now. No home, no alias that wasn't compromised, and a storm that threatened to claim her life before the Russian hunters could. The descent into the Swan. Her boots, soaked through and frozen, crunched painfully on the cobblestones. Her lungs burned with every breath of sub-zero air. She needed heat. She needed noise. Most of all, she needed a place where the shadows were thick enough to swallow her whole. That was when she saw it. A weathered wooden sign swaying violently in the wind, a silver bird etched into its grain, half obscured by a drift of snow. The Silver Swan. It was a basement jazz bar tucked away beneath the foundations of a 16th-century clockmaker's shop. As she pushed open the heavy iron-studded door, a wave of heat, tobacco smoke, and the low, soulful moan of a saxophone washed over her. It was a sensory assault that felt, for the first time in months, like life. The bar was a subterranean sanctuary. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, sweating with condensation, and the lighting was a dim, amber glow that seemed to emanate from the bourbon bottles behind the bar. It was the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be found, where the music was loud enough to drown out a guilty conscience. Lena moved to the far corner of the bar, as far from the entrance as possible. She kept her coat on, the collar turned up, her mousy brown hair plastered to her forehead with melted snow. "Bourbon," she croaked, her voice cracking. "Neat." The bartender, a man with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen too many secrets, poured the drink without a word. She downed it in one go, the liquid fire searing her throat and blooming in her chest. She signaled for another. She needed to stop her hands from shaking. She needed to think. The hunters in the haze. The jazz quartet on the small stage was playing something dissonant and fast, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the racing of her heart. Lena watched the room through the mirror behind the bar, her eyes scanning every face. There were students, old men nursing beers, and a few couples lost in each other. Then, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A gust of icy wind followed two men into the bar. They didn't look like jazz enthusiasts. They wore leather jackets that strained against their thick necks, and their eyes didn't settle on the stage or the bar. They were sweeping the room with a professional, lethal efficiency. Volkov's men. Lena felt the world tilt. How? She had been so careful. She had doubled back. She had changed her gait. But she had forgotten one thing. She was a vain, and to men who hunted for a living, she carried a scent of privilege and desperation that no dye or drab coat could fully mask. She didn't move. She couldn't. If she ran, they would see her. If she stayed, they would find her. She stared into her bourbon, watching the amber liquid tremble. The lead hunter, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, nudged his partner and pointed toward the corner. Toward her. They began to move, weaving through the small tables with the slow, deliberate grace of wolves who knew their prey was cornered. Lena's hand slipped into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, hard steel of her pistol. I won't go back, she thought, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing through her fear. I will die in this basement before I let them touch me. The shadow intervenes just as the men reach the edge of her table. A shadow detached itself from the darkest corner of the room. It was as if the air itself had solidified. One moment the hunters were closing in on their prize, and the next, a man was standing in their path. He was tall, leaning casually against a stone pillar, a glass of dark wine in his hand. He hadn't raised his voice, but the entire bar seemed to go silent as he spoke. "You're blocking the view," the stranger said. It was Dante Moretti. He wasn't wearing the expensive overcoat from the docks. He was in a simple black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by faint, silver scars. He looked relaxed, almost bored, but his green eyes were fixed on the lead hunter with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "Get out of the way, pal," the scarred man growled, his hand moving toward his waistband. "This isn't your business." Dante took a slow sip of his wine, his gaze never wavering. "Everything in this city is my business, especially when someone brings trash into a place as fine as this." The second hunter stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Do you know who we work for? We're Volkovs. Move, or we'll bury you in the snow." Dante didn't flinch. He didn't even put down his glass. Instead, he moved with a speed that the human eye could barely register. In one fluid motion, he stepped into the scarred man's space, his elbow connecting with the man's solar plexus. As the hunter gasped for air, Dante grabbed his wrist, twisted it with a sickening pop, and drove his forehead into the man's nose. The sound of shattering bone echoed over the saxophone. The second hunter lunged, but Dante was already gone. He spun behind the man, caught him in a chokehold, and whispered something into his ear, a few short words that turned the hunter's face from rage to absolute, soul-crushing terror. Dante let go. The man collapsed, dragging his unconscious, bleeding partner toward the stairs. They didn't look back. They scrambled out into the blizzard like beaten curs. The price of salvation. The bar patrons began to murmur, the music stuttered and then resumed, but Lena remained frozen. Her hand was still gripped around her gun in her pocket. Dante turned to her, his expression shifting from a mask of violence to one of quiet, mocking concern. He walked over and sat in the chair directly opposite her, the chair the hunters had intended to take. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, smooth rasp. "Geneva is a city of neutrality, but even neutrality has its limits." "How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't find you, Elena. I never lost you." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "I watched you walk away from the car. I watched you hide in that bakery. I watched you shiver. I wanted to see how long it would take for you to realize that you can't survive this world alone." "So, this was a lesson?" she asked, a spark of anger returning to her eyes. "You let them find me just to prove a point?" Dante's eyes darkened, the green turning to the color of a stormy sea. "I didn't let them find you. They were always going to find you. Your father has put a bounty on your head that would tempt a saint, and Volkov is not a saint. I simply chose the moment to intervene." He leaned forward, the scent of cedar and expensive wine surrounding her. "The hunters are gone for tonight, but tomorrow there will be more, and the day after. They will follow the trail of Lena Miller until there is nowhere left to go." Lena looked at the man across from her. He was a Moretti, the blood enemy of her house. He was a killer, a criminal, a man who moved through the world with a terrifying lack of conscience. But he was also the only reason she wasn't in the back of a Russian van right now. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to a vein?" Dante reached out and, for the second time, touched a lock of her hair. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the freezing night. Because the Vanes have always been unimaginative. They saw a pawn. They saw a bargaining chip. They didn't see the fire beneath the ice. He stood up, offering her his hand. It wasn't an order this time. It was an invitation. The Silver Swan is a beautiful place to hide, Elena, but it's still a cage. Come with me. I'll teach you how to hunt the people who are hunting you. Lena looked at his hand. She looked at the blood on his knuckles, the blood he had shed for her. She thought of the attic apartment on Rue de la Tertasse, now a crime scene. She thought of the golden girl she used to be and the ghost she had become. Slowly, she took her hand out of her pocket. She didn't reach for her gun. She reached for him. "Where are we going?" she asked. Dante's mouth curved into a dark, dangerous smile. To a place where ghosts learn to bite. As they climbed the stairs and stepped out into the howling blizzard, the Silver Swan faded into the white haze behind them. The woman who had been running for 6 months finally stopped. She didn't know if she was stepping into safety or into a different kind of hell, but for the first time since she had left London, she wasn't walking alone. The storm raged on, but as Dante pulled her close to shield her from the wind, Elena Vane realized that the cold couldn't reach her anymore. The fire he had spoken of had finally been lit. The drive from the smoke-filled sanctuary of the Silver Swan to the outskirts of the Cologne district was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like a third passenger in the car. Dante Moretti drove a matte black armoured SUV with a surgeon's precision, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel, despite the treacherous ice coating the roads. Beside him, Eleanor, still dressed in the drab, salt-stained rags of Lena Miller, stared out at the blurred white world of the Geneva suburbs. Every few minutes she would steal a glance at his profile. He was an enigma wrapped in a tailored silk shirt. He had just shattered a man's face for her, yet he didn't look like a man who had just committed an act of extreme violence. He looked like a man who had just finished a casual dinner. "You're staring," Dante said, his voice cutting through the hum of the heater. He didn't turn his head. "I'm trying to figure out which version of you is real," she replied, her voice regaining the sharp, crystalline edge of her London upbringing. The gentleman at the docks, the butcher in the jazz bar, or the chauffeur? Dante's lips quirked into a ghost of a smile. "In our world, Elena, the real version of a person is a luxury. We are whatever the situation requires us to be. Right now, I am your host. Don't make me regret it." The fortress on the hill. They pulled up to a set of massive wrought iron gates that opened silently upon their arrival. The SUV wound up a long, heated driveway lined with ancient pines, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. At the summit sat a villa that looked less like a home and more like a modernist fortress. It was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and grey stone, perched on a cliffside with a commanding view of Lake Geneva. "This isn't a safe house," Elena remarked as they stepped into the foyer. The floor was heated marble and the air smelled of expensive citrus and old money. "Safe houses are for people who are afraid," Dante said, tossing his keys onto a side table. "This is my home. No one enters here without my invitation, and no one leaves without my permission." He turned to look at her, his green eyes scanning her dishevelled appearance. "You look like a shipwreck survivor. Upstairs, third door on the left. You'll find clothes that don't belong in a charity bin. Bathe, eat. We talk in an hour." The transformation. Elena did as she was told. The bathroom was a sanctuary of steam and rain showers, filled with soaps that cost more than a month of her previous rent. As she scrubbed the mousy brown dye from her hair, realizing Dante was right, it had been a terrible job, she watched the water run brown, then clear, until her natural gold began to shimmer again in the recessed lighting. In the dressing room, she found a collection of clothes that were hauntingly close to her exact style. Black cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers, silk slips. Dante hadn't just watched her for months. He had memorized her. It was a realization that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She chose a charcoal silk dress that hugged her frame, simple yet elegant. When she walked down the floating glass staircase an hour later, she was no longer Lena Miller. She was Elena Vane again, but with a hollow, hungry look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Dante was waiting in a sprawling library, a fire roaring in the hearth. He held 2 glasses of deep amber liquid. He handed her one. Lafroig, he noted. Peated, strong. It helps with the transition. Eleanor took a sip, the smoky peat burning away the last of the Geneva frost. She sat opposite him in a leather wingback chair. "All right, Dante, you've played the hero. You've shown me your palace. Now tell me the truth. Why am I here?" The terms of the pact. Dante set his glass down on a low table. The playfulness was gone. His face became a mask of cold, calculated ambition. "Your father, Julian Vane, is a dinosaur," Dante began. "He thinks the old ways, the blood oaths, the arranged marriages, the public executions, are still the only way to hold power. He's wrong. The world has moved to data, logistics, and quiet influence. But your father is standing in the way of a future I have been building for a decade." Elena narrowed her eyes. "You want to take over the Vane Syndicate." "No," Dante corrected. "I want to dismantle it. I want to absorb the legitimate assets and bury the rest. But your father's new alliance with the Volkovs makes him dangerous. Volkov brings the brute force Julian lacks. Together, they create a wall that disrupts my trade routes and my digital interests." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "The marriage was the glue. If you had married Volkov's son, the 2 families would have become a monolith. By running away, you didn't just save yourself. You created a crack in that wall. But a crack isn't enough. I need a breach." "And I'm the breach," Elena whispered. "You are the only person who knows Julian's private ciphers. You know the locations of his offshore servers. You know which politicians are on his payroll because you were the one who sat at those dinner parties and watched him hand over the envelopes." Dante stood up and began to pace. "Julian thinks you're a weak girl who ran because she was scared. I know you ran because you were the only one smart enough to see that the ship was sinking. Help me sink it faster." The unholy terms. Elena laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "So this is the unholy pact? I trade one master for another. I help you destroy my father, and in return, I become a Moretti asset?" Dante stopped pacing and looked at her. The intensity in his gaze was enough to make her heart skip a beat. "I am not your father, Elena. I don't want a puppet. I want an architect. Help me bring down the Vane-Volkov alliance, and I will give you the one thing you've never had: total, unadulterated freedom." "Freedom?" she scoffed. "In this world?" "Total freedom," he repeated. "The Moretti name carries enough weight to scrub your record clean. I will provide you with a new identity, a real one this time, not a Lena Miller ghost. I will fund whatever life you want, anywhere in the world. But more importantly," he stepped closer, standing directly over her chair, "I will give you the pleasure of watching Julian Vane realize that the daughter he discarded was the one who pulled the rug out from under him. Revenge is a powerful motivator, Elena. Don't pretend you don't want it." Elena looked up at him. She saw the ruthlessness, yes, but she also saw a strange kind of respect. Dante Moretti was a monster, but he was a monster who treated her as an equal, not a pawn. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Dante's eyes flared with a dark light. "Julian is hosting a summit in 3 weeks. It's a shadow meeting of the 5 major families to formalize the Volkov merger. He thinks he's safe because he's moved his digital ledger to a cold storage server in the London vault. The vault beneath the manor, Elena said, a memory of cold stone and steel doors surfacing. Exactly. No one can hack it from the outside. Someone has to be inside. Someone who knows the biometric bypasses. Someone Julian wouldn't expect to see until it was too late. The spark of betrayal. The weight of the request hung in the air. He was asking her to return to the heart of the nightmare she had barely escaped. He was asking her to walk back into the lion's den with nothing but her wits and his backing. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, testing the waters. Dante shrugged, though his eyes remained fixed on her. "Then you leave this house tonight. I'll give you a car and enough money to reach the border. But you saw those men at the bar. They won't stop. Eventually, they will catch you. And when Volkov gets his hands on a runaway bride, he won't be as polite as I am." He reached out his hand. "So, Elena Vane, do we destroy them together? Or do you go back to being a ghost?" Elena looked at his hand, the hand that had saved her, the hand that held the power to shatter her world or rebuild it. She thought of her father's cold voice in the study. She thought of the bruises on her mother's arms. She thought of the 6 months of fear and hunger in the attic. She stood up, her silk dress rustling in the quiet library. She didn't take his hand immediately. Instead, she stepped into his space, her eyes defiant. "If I do this," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "I want my father's head. Not literally. I want him to watch everything he built crumble into dust. I want him to know it was me." Dante smiled, a slow, lethal grin that promised a storm. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Elena reached out and gripped his hand. His palm was warm, his grip like iron. As their hands locked, a strange energy surged through her. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a covenant. "To the unholy pact," Dante whispered. "To the end of the veins," Elena replied. Outside, the blizzard continued to howl, but inside the fortress, the temperature had shifted. The alliance was forged. The ghost was gone. The hunt had begun. Elena Vane was no longer running. She was preparing to burn down the world that had tried to consume her. And beside her stood the man who would provide the matches. The Geneva winter deepened, turning the world outside the Moretti villa into a monochromatic landscape of white and grey. But inside the glass and steel fortress, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of intensity. The unholy pact was no longer a theoretical agreement. It had become a grueling, daily reality. Dante Moretti was a man who did nothing by halves. If Eleanor was to be the weapon that dismantled the Vane Empire, he intended to sharpen her until she was lethal. He called this phase training the sparrow, a name that Elena found both poetic and infuriating. A sparrow is small, common, and easily overlooked, Dante explained on their first morning in the villa's expansive underground training wing. But a sparrow can fly through a storm that would ground an eagle, and if a sparrow is carrying a drop of poison, it can kill a king. The art of the invisible. The training did not begin with guns or knives. It began with the mind. Dante spent hours in the library with her, but they weren't reading poetry. He laid out digital maps of London, blueprints of the Vane Manor, and dossiers on every high-ranking member of the syndicate. "Memory is your first line of defense," Dante said, pacing behind her chair. "If you stumble in a hallway, if you hesitate at a keypad, you die. Describe the security room in the basement." 3 monitors on the left wall, 2 on the right, Elena recited, her eyes closed. A biometric lock on the main server. The guards rotate every 4 hours, but there's a 3-minute blind spot during the shift change at 2 a.m. because of the hallway camera's sweep. Correct. Now, tell me the middle name of the Minister of Trade's mistress. Clarice. And she has a penchant for lavender-scented stationery, Elena added, her voice weary. Dante, why does this matter? Dante stopped pacing and leaned over her shoulder, his face inches from hers. Because power isn't just about bullets, Elena. It's about leverage. You aren't just going in there to steal data. You're going in to remind these men that you know their souls. A woman who knows your secrets is more terrifying than a man with a gun. The sparring of souls. In the afternoons, the training turned physical. The villa's gym was a sleek, minimalist space, but it felt like a torture chamber to Elena. Dante pushed her until her muscles screamed and her lungs burned. He taught her Krav Maga, not for sport, but for survival. You are smaller than your father's men, Dante said, circling her on the mat. He was dressed in black tactical gear, looking like a shadow come to life. You will never win a fair fight, so don't fight fair. Use their weight against them. Aim for the eyes, the throat, the groin. Be the bird that pecks out the hunter's eyes. He lunged at her, his movements a blur of controlled violence. Elena tried to sidestep, but he caught her arm and pinned her to the mat in seconds. The heat of his body pressed against hers, a stark contrast to the cold glass walls of the gym. Again, he growled. I can't, she wheezed, her hair damp with sweat. The Volkovs won't care if you're tired, Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look into his emerald eyes. They will take you back to that room in London. They will put the ring on your finger. Is that what you want? Rage, cold and white-hot, flared in Elena's chest. She didn't think. She reacted. She used her heel to strike his shin and twisted her body, using her momentum to throw him off. As he tumbled, she scrambled to her feet and lunged, her fingers curled like claws. Dante caught her wrists just inches from his face, a dark grin spreading across his lips. There she is, the vein fire. He didn't let go. For a long moment they stood there panting, the air between them thick with adrenaline and something far more complicated. Elena realized then that the Sparrow was changing. She wasn't just learning to fight. She was learning to enjoy the feeling of power. The mirror and the mask. By the second month, the physical bruises began to fade, replaced by a hardened, sleek grace. But the most difficult part of the training was the social aspect. Dante began hosting small, private dinners at the villa with his legitimate business associates, men who had no idea they were sitting across from a fugitive heiress. You have to be Lena Miller, the sophisticated tech consultant, while remaining Elena Vane, the ghost, Dante instructed her, as she dressed for a dinner with a Swiss banker. He walked into her dressing room, holding a velvet box. Inside was a necklace of black pearls, dark, elegant, and ominous. He stepped behind her to clasp it around her neck. His fingers were cool against her skin, sending a jiver through her. Lena Miller is efficient, quiet, and slightly bored, Dante whispered in her ear, his breath hot against her neck. She doesn't have a past. She only has a function. Can you play the part? Elena looked at herself in the mirror. She wore a tailored black suit that screamed professional power. Her hair was back to its natural gold, but styled in a sharp, modern bob. She looked lethal. I've been playing parts my whole life, Dante, she said, meeting his gaze in the reflection. I was the perfect daughter. I was the tragic runaway. Lena Miller is just another mask. Good, Dante said, his hands lingering on her shoulders. But remember, never forget the girl beneath the mask. She's the one I need for London. The midnight revelations. The nights were the hardest. After the training ended and the guests left, the silence of the villa felt oppressive. Eleanor often found herself wandering the library, unable to sleep. More often than not, Dante was already there, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the frozen lake. One night, the moon was particularly bright, casting a silver glow over the library's leather-bound books. Elena sat on the edge of a mahogany table, watching him. "Why are you doing this, Dante?" she asked quietly. "I know you want to destroy my father, but you're investing a lot of time in a sparrow. You could have just hired an assassin." Dante turned, the moonlight catching the scars on his hands, the marks of a man who had fought his way out of his own cage. An assassin can kill a man, but an assassin can't kill a legacy. To destroy Julian Vane, I need a poet. I need someone who understands exactly what he loves so they can burn it down in front of him. He walked over to her, standing so close she could smell the smoke and oak of his scotch. "And maybe I recognize the look in your eyes, Elena. The look of someone who was told they were a bird in a cage, only to realize the cage was made of glass all along." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of startling tenderness from a man who had spent the day throwing her onto a mat. "You aren't a tool, Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're the storm I've been waiting for." For a heartbeat, Elena thought he would kiss her. The tension was a living thing, a bridge between two broken worlds. But Dante pulled back, the mask of the Moretti Lord snapping back into place. "Get some rest," he said coldly. "Tomorrow we start with the biometric bypasses. You need to be able to mimic your father's heartbeat." The transformation complete. As the third month approached, the sparrow was gone. In her place stood a woman who moved with the silence of a ghost and the precision of a clock. Elena could strip a handgun in 40 seconds. She could bypass a Tier 4 firewall while holding a conversation about the Eurozone. She knew the layout of the Vane Manor better than the architect who built it. But more than that, she had found her center. She no longer felt like a victim fleeing a nightmare. She felt like a hunter waiting for the sun to set. Dante stood with her on the balcony on the final night before their departure for London. The snow had finally stopped, and the stars were reflected in the still, black water of Lake Geneva. "Are you ready?" he asked. Eleanor didn't look at him. She looked at her hands, steady, strong, and capable of ending a life or starting a revolution. "Julian Vane thinks he sold a daughter," she said, her voice as cold as the alpine air. "He has no idea he actually bought an executioner." Dante handed her a small, encrypted drive. "Then let's go to London, Elena. Let's show them what happens when a sparrow decides to stop singing and starts to bite." The training was over. The game was beginning. And as they walked back into the villa to finalize the logistics of their descent into England, Elena realized that the sparrow hadn't just survived the storm. She had become it. The Moretti and the Vane were no longer just names on a map of organized crime. They were the architects of a new world, one that would be built on the ashes of the old. And as Elena looked at Dante, she knew that whatever happened in London, she would never go back to being the girl in the gilded cage. She had found her wings, and they were made of steel. The transition from the cold, sterile mountains of Switzerland to the rain-slicked, neon-lit streets of London felt like a descent into a familiar hell. But Eleanor Vane was no longer the girl who had fled in the middle of the night with a dyed brown bob and a heart full of glass. As the private jet touched down at a secluded airfield on the outskirts of the city, she felt a strange, icy calm. Beside her, Dante Moretti was a study in lethal elegance. He had traded his tactical gear for a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed power and whispered of violence. He didn't look like a man arriving for a corporate takeover. He looked like a predator returning to his favorite hunting ground. "The board is set. Dante said as they stepped into a waiting black sedan. Your father and Volkov are finalizing the logistics of the shipping routes. They believe the only thing left to do is sign the papers and find you. They have no idea the fire has already reached the basement. The digital ghost. Their base of operations was a penthouse overlooking the Thames, a glass cathedral of high-tech surveillance and minimalist luxury. Dante's team, a ghost crew of elite hackers and ex-intelligence officers, had already laid the groundwork. The objective tonight isn't the vault, Dante instructed, standing before a wall of monitors. Tonight, we bleed them. We sow the seeds of the digital ghost. I want Volkov to believe Julian is skimming from the accounts, and I want Julian to believe Volkov is selling their secrets to the Interpol. Elena sat at the primary terminal. Her fingers hovered over the keys, a phantom memory of the codes her father had forced her to memorize as a child. She wasn't just a hacker, she was the key. She knew the rhythm of the Vane servers, the specific handshake the system required to grant administrator access without triggering the silent alarms. Ready? Dante asked, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The warmth of his presence was the only thing keeping her grounded in the sea of blue light. Let's burn it down, she whispered. She began. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic, percussive speed. She bypassed the first layer of encryption, a complex sequence based on her mother's birthday, a cruel irony that only Julian would find sentimental. She slipped past the Volkov firewalls using a back door Dante's team had been prying open for weeks. She injected the ghost virus. It was a masterpiece of digital deception. To Julian's eyes, the Volkovs were redirecting millions in cryptocurrency to a private wallet in the Cayman Islands. To the Volkovs, the Vane servers were leaking encrypted manifests of their drug shipments to a secure server at New Scotland Yard. It's taking hold, Elena said, her eyes fixed on the cascading lines of code. Distrust is a virus, Dante. Once it starts, it feeds on itself. The night in the shadows. While the digital strike rippled through the underworld, the physical strike required a different kind of finesse. Dante and Elena left the penthouse under the cover of a thick London fog. They weren't heading for the manor yet. They were heading for a secure warehouse in the Docklands, a major hub for the Volkov Vane logistics chain. They have a physical ledger here, Dante explained as they crouched on a rooftop overlooking the shipping containers. Julian is old school. He keeps a paper backup of every bribe he's ever paid. If we get that, we don't just destroy his alliance, we destroy his legacy. Elena watched through a pair of thermal binoculars. The guards moved with the mechanical precision of trained soldiers. 2 on the perimeter, 3 inside. Biometric scanner on the side entrance. That's your cue, Sparrow, Dante said. They moved like shadows. Elena felt the adrenaline coursing through her, a sharp, electric hum that made her senses preternaturally acute. She reached the side entrance and pulled out a small, high-tech device Dante had given her. A biometric cloner. She pressed it against the scanner, and the device cycled through the stolen thumbprints of a mid-level Vane manager they had intercepted in Zurich. Click. The door slid open. Elena slipped inside, Dante following close behind, a silenced pistol in his hand. The warehouse was a cavernous space, smelling of oil, salt, and stale air. They moved between the towering stacks of crates until they reached a secure office in the center. Cover me, Elena whispered. She went to work on the safe. It wasn't digital, it was a classic mechanical lock, the kind Julian loved because he believed computers could be lied to, but steel could not. Elena used a stethoscope, listening for the faint click of the tumblers, a skill Dante had forced her to practice for hundreds of hours in the villa's basement. Left to 42, right to 18, left to 09. The heavy door swung open. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book. Elena grabbed it, her heart thumping against her ribs. "I have it," she breathed. "Move!" Dante hissed. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The guards had found them. The dance of fire and rain. The escape was a blur of violence and speed. Dante fired 2 shots, silent, precise, dropping the lead guard before the man could raise his radio. He grabbed Elena by the arm, pulling her toward the loading docks. "This way." They burst out into the rain. The alarm finally began to wail, a mournful, screeching sound that echoed across the river. More guards were converging, their flashlights dancing like fireflies in the fog. "Get to the bike," Dante shouted over the wind. He had parked a high-powered Ducati beneath a bridge near the docks. As they scrambled toward it, Elena heard the roar of engines behind them. Black SUVs were tearing through the warehouse complex, their tires screaming on the wet asphalt. Dante hopped on the bike and Elena climbed behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She gripped the leather-bound ledger to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Hold on!" The bike roared to life, a mechanical beast screaming in the night. Dante tore out from under the bridge, weaving between the shipping containers with a suicidal bravery. The SUVs were hot on their heels, the sound of gunfire muffled by the rain and the wind. Elena felt the wind whipping at her face, the cold rain stinging her eyes. She looked back and saw the muzzle flashes in the dark. Dante leaned the bike low into a turn, his knee nearly touching the ground. He was a demon of the night, a man who feared nothing because he owned the shadows. He took a sudden, sharp turn into a narrow alleyway that the SUVs couldn't navigate. The sound of screeching brakes and crashing metal followed them as the lead SUV slammed into a brick wall. Minutes later, they were back in the city, the bike purring like a kitten as they blended into the late-night traffic of Soho. The quiet, after the storm. They returned to the penthouse, soaked to the bone and shivering with the come-down from the adrenaline. Dante tossed his jacket onto a chair and turned to Eleanor. His hair was matted with rain, his eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. "You were perfect," he said, his voice low and raspy. Eleanor leaned against the glass window, looking out at the city she had once feared. She held the ledger in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn leather. I felt like I was back there, Dante, in that house. But I wasn't the girl hiding in the vents. I was the one taking what was mine." Dante walked over to her. He didn't say anything. He simply reached out and took the ledger from her hands, setting it on the table. Then he grabbed her shoulders and pulled her into him. The kiss was a collision of fire and rain. It was the culmination of months of tension, of training, of shared secrets and whispered threats. It was desperate, hungry, and full of the dark energy that bound them together. Elena wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, wanting to lose herself in the power he offered. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Dante's eyes were dark green, the color of the deep sea during a storm. "The first strike is over," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "But the war is just beginning. They're going to be looking for blood tomorrow." "Let them look," Eleanor said, her voice steady and lethal. "They're looking for a girl. They aren't ready for what we've become. The ripples of chaos. By morning, the underworld of London was in a state of quiet, terrifying panic. The Volkovs had found the digital leaks. They had seen the millions missing from their accounts. In Moscow, the patriarch of the clan was already calling for Julian Vane's head. In the Vane manor, Julian was staring at the empty safe in the warehouse office, his face a mask of purple rage. He didn't know who had done it, but he knew the hand that had opened the safe. He knew the tumblers. He knew his daughter was alive. Elena sat on the balcony of the penthouse sipping a cup of black coffee as she watched the sun struggle to rise through the London fog. On the tablet in her lap, the news was full of unexplained fluctuations in the shipping markets and unidentified cyber attacks on private equity firms. Dante walked out behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "The digital ghost is haunting them, Elena. They're turning on each other. Julian has already moved his private guard to the manor. He's hunkering down." "He's scared," Elena said, a cold smile touching her lips. "He used to tell me that fear was the only true currency. I think he's finally realizing he's bankrupt." "We move on the manor in 2 days," Dante said. "The summit is the final act. Are you ready to see the end of the veins?" Elena looked out at the city. She thought of the sparrow. She thought of the training. She thought of the unholy pact. "I've been ready since the night I dyed my hair in a public restroom," she said. The first strike had been a success, but the real hunt was about to begin. The sparrow had bitten, and the poison was already in the king's veins. Now, all that was left was to watch him fall, and Elena Vane intended to be there to witness every second of it. The rain continued to fall over London, but for the first time in her life, it didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like a cleansing. The world was burning, and Elena was the one holding the torch. Beside her, Dante Moretti watched the flames with her, a silent partner in the chaos they had created. The game was no longer about survival, it was about legacy, and the legacy of the Vanes was about to be written in ash. The euphoria of the first strike was a fleeting ghost. In the world of the Syndicate, victory was often just the prelude to a deeper betrayal. The London fog had thickened, turning the city into a grey purgatory where the streetlights struggled to penetrate the gloom. Elena stood in the centre of the penthouse, the leather-bound ledger open on the mahogany desk before her. The data they had stolen was more than just numbers. It was a map of her father's sins. But as she traced the familiar handwriting of Julian Vane, a sense of unease began to coil in her stomach. The villa in Geneva had felt like a fortress, but this glass penthouse felt like a target. Dante was in the adjacent room, his voice low and sharp, as he spoke into an encrypted phone. He was coordinating the final move, the checkmate at the upcoming summit. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by cameras, but by eyes that knew her soul. The shadow of the past. "You need to sleep, Elena," Dante said, stepping back into the room. He looked weary, the shadows under his eyes deepening the green of his iris. "We move on the manor in 36 hours. You can't be fraying at the edges." "I'm not fraying," she lied, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "I'm just remembering. My father always said that the most dangerous enemy is the one who remembers your childhood bedtime stories." Dante walked over, his presence a grounding force. "Your father is a man of the past. We are the future. Don't let his ghosts into this room." He reached out to touch her face, but a sudden chime from the security console interrupted the moment. One of the perimeter sensors in the service elevator had been tripped. "Stay here," Dante commanded, his hand instantly moving to the holster at his small of his back. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Elena watched him slip out of the room, a predator moving toward a threat. She did as she was told, locking the heavy oak door and retreating to the desk where her pistol lay. The silence of the penthouse became deafening, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic thumping of her own heart. The ghost in the hallway minutes crawled by. The silence stretched until it felt brittle. Then a soft, rhythmic tapping sounded. Not on the door, but on the floor-to-ceiling glass window overlooking the terrace. Elena spun around, her gun raised. Outside, standing in the rain and the wind, was a man she hadn't seen in a year. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that looked out of place against the backdrop of the storm. He didn't look like an assassin. He looked like family. It was Arthur Penhaligon, her childhood bodyguard, the man who had taught her how to ride a horse and how to hide her vegetables during dinner. He was the only person in the Vane Manor who had ever shown her a shred of genuine kindness. He held up a hand, palm open, the old sign for safe. Elena's heart twisted. Against every instinct Dante had hammered into her, she moved to the glass door and unlocked it. Arthur stepped inside, smelling of rain and the expensive peppermint candies he used to carry in his pockets. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "My dear girl, look what you've done." "Arthur, how did you find me?" she asked, her gun still held at her side, though her grip had loosened. "I've known your scent since you were 5, Elena. Your father sent the others to the docks and the hotels. I knew you'd find a view of the river. You always loved the water." He looked around the penthouse, his eyes landing on the Moretti insignia on a discarded laptop bag. "But a Moretti? Elena, do you have any idea what you've walked into?" The Judas revelation. "Dante saved me, Arthur," Elena said, her voice defensive. "He gave me a choice when my father gave me a price tag." Arthur sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He walked toward her, and for a moment, Elena wanted to fall into his arms and be the little girl again. But then she saw it, the slight, practiced twitch of his right hand toward his sleeve. "Dante Moretti didn't save you, Elena," Arthur said, his voice turning cold and professional. "He recruited you. Do you think it was a coincidence that the Morettis were in Geneva? Do you think it was a coincidence that he was at that jazz bar?" Elena froze. "What are you talking about?" "The Morettis have wanted the Vane shipping routes for 20 years. They couldn't take them by force, so they waited for a weakness. You were that weakness, Elena. Dante didn't find you. He tracked you from the moment you left London. He let the Volkovs get close just so he could play the hero. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a key to the Vane vault, and you handed it to him on a silver platter." The world felt like it was tilting. Dante's words in the library surfaced. "I recognized the look in your eyes. Someone who was told they were a bird in a cage. Was it all a script? A calculated seduction designed to turn a desperate girl into a lethal asset?" "You're lying," she breathed, though the seed of doubt had already taken root. "Am I?" Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet. He slid it across the desk. "This is the communication log between Dante and the Moretti patriarch. Date, 6 months ago. Location, Zurich. Subject, the Vane asset." Elena looked at the screen. The words blurred before her eyes, but the gist was clear. Dante had been reporting her progress, her training, and her emotional susceptibility back to his family since day one. The kiss of betrayal. The pain was physical, a sharp blade twisting in her chest. She had let him in. She had shared her ghosts with him. She had kissed him with the desperate hunger of someone who finally believed they weren't alone. "My father sent you to bring me back," Elena said, her voice hollow. "Your father wants you home, yes," Arthur said, stepping closer. "But the Volkovs, they want an example. Julian can't protect you anymore, Elena. But I can. Come with me now. I have a plane waiting. I'll take you to the estate in Scotland. We can disappear together." He reached out and cupped her cheek. It was the same gesture Dante had used, but it felt different now. It felt like a tether. "Come home, Elena," Arthur whispered. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a chaste, fatherly gesture. But as his lips touched her skin, Elena felt the sharp prick of a needle at the base of her neck. She gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her throat. Arthur stood there, the small sedative ring on his finger glinting in the amber light. His face was no longer that of a mentor. It was a mask of cold, regretful duty. "I'm sorry, my dear," Arthur said as her knees began to buckle, "but the Vane legacy must be preserved, even if it means bringing you back in a box." The awakening of the sparrow. As the darkness began to pull at the edges of her vision, Elena felt a surge of something that wasn't fear. It was the Vane fire Dante had spoken of. But this time, it wasn't directed at her father. It was directed at the world that thought she was something to be manipulated, bought, or sedated. She didn't fall. She leaned against the desk, her fingers fumbling for the drawer where she had hidden the ledger. You were the one who taught me," she wheezed, her voice slurring. "Never trust the ones who remember your bedtime stories." Arthur's eyes widened as she pulled not the ledger, but the small, palm-sized pistol from the drawer. "Elena, don't," he warned, stepping forward. Bang! The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet grazed Arthur's shoulder, spinning him around. The shock of the attack bought her the seconds she needed. She slammed the desk drawer shut, locking it, and scrambled towards the balcony. "Dante!" she screamed, though she didn't know if he could hear her. She didn't know if he was her savior or her architect anymore, but he was the only one who had taught her how to survive a Judas kiss. Arthur lunged for her, his face contorted in a snarl, but the door to the penthouse exploded inward. The reckoning Dante Moretti burst into the room, his eyes wild with a fury that made Arthur's betrayal look like a playground spat. He didn't hesitate. He tackled Arthur to the ground, the two men becoming a blur of black cloth and silver hair. Elena slumped against the glass, the sedative finally winning. She watched through a haze as Dante pinned Arthur to the floor, his forearm pressed against the older man's throat. "Where is she?" Dante roared. "What did you do to her?" Arthur laughed, a wet, choking sound. "She knows, Moretti. She knows you're just a different kind of cage." Dante's eyes flickered to Eleanor, and for a heartbeat she saw a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Then he turned back to Arthur and delivered a single, crushing blow that silenced the bodyguard forever. Dante scrambled over to Elena, gathering her into his arms. Elena, look at me. Stay with me." She looked at him, her vision fading to black. She saw the man who had lied to her, the man who had used her, and the man who had just killed for her. "The Judas kiss," she whispered, her hand weakly clutching his shirt. "Which one are you, Dante?" "I'm the one who's taking you home," he whispered back, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. As the darkness finally claimed her, Elena Vane realized that the game had changed again. The unholy pact was broken, replaced by a much more dangerous reality. She was no longer a sparrow, and she was no longer a ghost. She was a weapon that had realized it was being held by two different hands. And when she woke up, she was going to make sure both hands bled. The rain continued to lash against the penthouse windows, washing away the blood on the floor, but the stain of the Judas kiss remained. The climb to the London manor was no longer about revenge. It was about a girl finding her own truth in a world built on lies. And this time, she wouldn't be walking behind anyone. The awakening was not a gentle return to consciousness. It was a violent collision with reality. Elena's head throbbed with the rhythmic pulse of a drum, a lingering souvenir of Arthur's sedative. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she wasn't in the penthouse. She was in the back seat of the armoured SUV, her head resting on a cold leather headrest. Beside her, Dante was staring out the window, his jaw set in a line of iron. The interior of the car smelled of gunpowder and rain. "You're awake," he said, not looking at her. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that had characterized their nights in the library. Elena sat up, her muscles screaming in protest. She remembered the penthouse. She remembered Arthur's peppermint scent and his poisonous needle. And she remembered the tablet, the vain asset. "Why didn't you let him take me, Dante?" she asked, her voice raspy. "If I'm just an asset, wouldn't it be easier to let the Volkovs have me and then pick up the pieces of the syndicate once they've killed my father?" Dante finally turned to look at her. His emerald eyes were unreadable, shrouded in the dim light of the cabin. "Because I don't like people touching what belongs to me, and because Arthur was wrong. You aren't just a key to a vault. You're the one holding the match. Without you, the fire doesn't happen." "A match," Elena whispered, a bitter smile touching her lips. "Is that what we are? Fire and ash?" Dante didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, silver mask, a delicate filigree of lace and steel. "Put it on. We're 5 minutes away." The gates of hell. They were approaching the Vane Manor. It sat on the edge of Hampstead Heath like a sleeping beast, its windows glowing with a sinister amber light. This was the summit. The night the Vanes and Volkovs would finalize the merger that would drown London in Russian blood and Moretti tears. The driveway was a gauntlet of black luxury sedans and armed men in tailored suits. This was the Lion's Den, and they were walking through the front door. "The plan hasn't changed," Dante said as the car slowed to a halt. "I enter as the Mediterranean investor. You are my silent partner, Lena. We have 30 minutes to reach the basement vault before the signing ceremony begins. If we're caught, there is no extraction. We either succeed or we die in that house." Elena took the mask and tied it behind her head. She looked at herself in the darkened window. The silk dress she had chosen in Geneva was now a battle uniform. The sparrow was gone. She felt like a ghost, returning to haunt the man who had murdered her childhood. "I know the way," she said, her voice as cold as the English rain. The masquerade of monsters. They stepped out of the car and were immediately enveloped by the sounds of a high society gala. A string quartet was playing Vivaldi in the grand ballroom, the music drifting through the open French doors. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of cristal and beluga caviar. But beneath the surface of elegance, the air was thick with the scent of violence. The men in the room carried themselves with a heavy, predatory stillness. The women wore jewels that were worth more than the lives of the people who protected them. Eleanor felt a surge of nausea as she stepped into the foyer. Every corner of this house held a nightmare. The spot near the stairs where she had fallen when she was 6. The hallway where her mother had whispered her last goodbye. "Steady," Dante whispered, his hand catching her elbow. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't look at the memories, look at the targets." They moved through the ballroom, a pair of dark shadows in a room full of gilded light. Elena saw her father, Julian Vane, standing near the fireplace. He looked older, his face more sunken than she remembered, but his eyes were still the same. 2 chips of flint that saw people as nothing more than obstacles or tools. Beside him was Mikhail Volkov, a mountain of a man with a scarred face and a laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. They were clinking glasses. The deal was nearly done. "The descent now," Dante signaled. As the crowd moved toward the dining hall for the first course, Elena and Dante slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain near the library. Elena reached into her clutch and pulled out a small electronic jammer. She pressed it against the keypad of the service door. Green light. They slipped into the servants' corridor, the veins of the house that Elena had mapped out as a child. It was narrow, dimly lit, and smelled of floor wax and old stone. They moved with the silence of ghosts, descending the narrow spiral staircase that led to the sub-basement. "2 guards at the vault door," Elena whispered as they reached the final landing. "They won't be expecting anyone from the inside." Dante drew his silenced pistol. "Wait for my lead." He didn't use the gun. He used the environment. He threw a small glass marble toward the far end of the hallway. As the guards turned toward the sound, Dante moved like a blur of black silk. He neutralized the first guard with a sleeper hold before the man could even grunt. The second guard reached for his holster, but Eleanor was faster. She used a heavy brass candlestick she had grabbed from the library and brought it down on the man's temple with a sickening thud. The guard crumpled. Dante looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "The candlestick? Really?" "It was nearby," she panted, her heart racing. The heart of the Empire. They stood before the vault. It was a massive slab of brushed steel, etched with the Vane crest. It required a retinal scan, a thumbprint, and a 12-digit code that changed every hour based on a proprietary algorithm. "This is it," Dante said, stepping back to give her room. "Can you do it?" Elena stepped up to the console. The blue light of the retinal scanner hit her eye, and for a second, she feared the system wouldn't recognize her. "Identity confirmed, Elena Vane. Level 1. Access. Next, the thumbprint." She pressed her hand against the glass. "Access. Granted. Finally, the code." Elena closed her eyes. She didn't think of the numbers. She thought of the music her father used to play on the piano when he was teaching her the ciphers. It was a mathematical rhythm. 4, 9, 2, 1. The tumblers began to groan. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the sub-basement as the bolts retracted. The vault door swung open, revealing a room filled not with gold, but with servers. Thousands of blue lights flickered in the dark, humming like a swarm of angry bees. This was the lion's den. This was where the Vanes kept their soul. The breach. "Insert the drive," Dante commanded. Elena moved to the central terminal. Her hands were steady now. She plugged in the encrypted Moretti drive, the Judas virus, that would not only steal the data but rewrite the Vane manifests to incriminate every member of the Volkov family. "Uploading," she said. The progress bar began to crawl. 10%, 25%. "We have 10 minutes, Dante said, checking his watch. "The signing ceremony starts at the top of the hour. Once the drive finishes, the manor's internal alarms will trigger. We need to be out of the sub-basement before that happens." As they waited, the silence of the vault was broken by a sound that made Elena's blood run cold. The sound of slow, rhythmic clapping. They spun around. Standing in the doorway of the vault, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway, was Julian Vane. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a remote detonator. The lion's trap. "I knew you'd come for the servers, Elena," Julian said, his voice echoing in the cold room. "I taught you too well. You always were obsessed with the foundation of things." Dante raised his pistol, but Julian didn't flinch. "I wouldn't, Mr. Moretti," Julian said, his thumb hovering over the red button. "The sub-basement is rigged with thermite. If my heart stops, or if I press this button, this entire wing of the manor becomes a furnace. We all go down with the ship." "Father," Elena said, stepping forward. "It's over. The data is already uploading. Even if you kill us, the Vane name is done." Julian looked at his daughter, and for a second Elena saw a flicker of genuine grief in his eyes. "You think I care about the name? I cared about the legacy. I cared about the order. You chose chaos, Elena. You chose to bring a Moretti into my house." He turned his gaze to Dante. "And you. You thought you could use my daughter to gut me. You're no better than I am, Moretti. You just have a better tailor." "I'm nothing like you, Vane," Dante spat. "I don't sell my family." "No," Julian smiled cruelly. "You just buy them." the ultimate sacrifice. The progress bar reached 95%. The hum of the servers intensified. "Eleanor," Dante whispered, "get behind me." But Elena wasn't looking at Dante. She was looking at the detonator in her father's hand. She realized that Julian Vane wasn't planning on surviving the night. He was an old lion who would rather burn his kingdom to the ground than see it ruled by another. "Father, look at me," Elena said, her voice soft, pleading. She walked toward him, ignoring Dante's hissed warning. "You told me once that a Vane never surrenders, but you also told me that a Vane always knows when a deal is dead." She reached out her hand, just as she had to Dante in the library. "The deal is dead, Father. Give me the detonator. Let us walk away. You can disappear. You can have the life you denied me." Julian looked at her hand. His thumb trembled on the button. For a heartbeat, the lion wavered. The man who had been a monster for 40 years looked at the girl he had broken and saw the only thing he had ever truly created. 100%. Upload complete. The sirens began to wail, a piercing, screeching sound that shook the very foundations of the manor. "Go," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. He thrust the detonator into Eleanor's hand. "Go, before the Volkovs realize the floor is falling out from under them." "Father, go!" Julian roared. Dante grabbed Eleanor by the waist, practically carrying her out of the vault. As they ran back toward the servants' stairs, Eleanor looked back. Her father was sitting on a crate of servers, his head in his hands, as the red emergency lights bathed the room in the color of blood. The escape from the inferno. They burst out of the service entrance just as the first explosions rocked the sub-basement. The ballroom was in total chaos. The Volkovs were shouting, drawing weapons, as their phones began to buzz with notifications of the leaked data and the freezing of their assets. Dante didn't stop. He led Eleanor through the panicked crowd, through the smoke and the screams towards the front gates. "The car is waiting!" They dove into the SUV just as the eastern wing of the Vane Manor erupted in a pillar of orange flame. The lion's den was burning. The legacy of Julian Vane was being cremated in the heart of London. Elena clutched the detonator in her hand, her knuckles white. She watched through the rear window as the manor receded into the distance, a pyre against the black London sky. "He stayed," she whispered, a single tear finally escaping. Dante reached over and took her hand. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He didn't say he was sorry. He just held her hand with an iron grip as the city of London blurred past them. The return to the lion's den was over. The Vanes were gone. The Volkovs were ruined. And as Elena Vane looked at the man beside her, she realized that she was no longer a sparrow, a ghost, or a match. She was the survivor, and the world was about to find out exactly what that meant. The night did not end with the explosion. It ended with a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. From the vantage point of the black SUV, parked on a rise overlooking the burning ruins of the Vane estate, Elena watched the end of an era. The orange glow of the fire painted the low-hanging London clouds in hues of bruised purple and angry gold. Beside her, Dante remained as still as a statue carved from obsidian. He had the Judas drive, tucked into his inner pocket, the digital heart of the Vane Empire, now beating for the Morettis. But there was no triumph in his expression, only a grim, focused exhaustion. "It's done," he said, his voice barely audible over the distant wail of sirens. "Is it?" Elena asked. She looked at her hands. They were stained with soot and the phantom weight of the detonator. "My father is in there, Dante. He chose the fire." "He chose the only exit he had left," Dante replied. "Julian Vane was never going to live in a world where he was just another man. He was a king, or he was nothing. The shadow in the flames. But as the sirens drew closer, a flicker of movement caught Elena's eye near the edge of the estate's blackened tree line. A figure, staggered and scorched, emerged from the smoke. It wasn't the proud, iron-backed Julian Vane she knew. It was a ghost, dragging itself through the mud of the heath. Elena's breath hitched. He's alive. Without waiting for Dante's permission, she threw open the car door and ran. The cold night air hit her lungs like a slap, but she didn't feel it. She ran toward the man who had been her god and her tormentor, her heels sinking into the damp earth until she kicked them off, running barefoot through the frost. She reached him near a cluster of ancient oaks. Julian was on his knees, his bespoke tuxedo shredded, his face a mask of ash and blood. The lion looked like a wounded animal, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Father," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. Julian looked up. For a moment, the flinty hardness returned to his eyes, but it was brittle now, like glass about to shatter. "Elena, you stayed." "I came back for the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "Why, Father? Why did you give me the detonator? Why didn't you just let the room burn with all of us in it?" Julian coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers grazing the silver mask she still wore pushed up on her forehead. "Because a Vane always protects the asset." He smiled, a horrific, bloody thing. "And you, Elena, you are my greatest investment." The last confession. The cruelty of the statement hit her harder than any blow. Even at the edge of death, he saw her as a commodity. But then his grip on her arm tightened, and his voice dropped to a frantic whisper. "Listen to me. The Moretti. He's not what he seems. The drive. It has a secondary encryption, a dead man's switch. If he tries to integrate it into the Moretti servers, it will consume them too. I didn't just burn my house, Elena. I poisoned the well." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. She looked back at the SUV. Dante was standing by the open door, watching them. He looked like a savior, but in the light of the fire, his shadow was long and predatory. "He saved me," Elena whispered, more to herself than to her father. "He harvested you," Julian hissed, his strength fading. "He knew. I would never give the codes to a stranger. He needed a Vane to open the door. He used your grief like a scalpel. Don't let him win, Elena. Be the storm I raised you to be." With a final, shuddering breath, the hand on Elena's arm went limp. Julian Vane, the man who had ruled London's shadows for 3 decades, slumped forward into the cold London mud. He died as he had lived, trying to manipulate the pieces on the board one last time. The confrontation. Elena stood up slowly. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest. The lion was dead, but the cage was still very much intact. Dante approached her, his footsteps silent on the grass. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the body of his rival. "I'm sorry, Elena," he said, and for the first time, she couldn't tell if he was lying. "Was it true, Dante?" she asked, her voice steady and dangerous. "Did you know about the Volkovs in Geneva? Did you let them get close to me just so you could swoop in and play the knight in shining armor?" Dante didn't flinch. He met her gaze with an unblinking intensity. "I knew they were looking for you. I didn't know when they would strike, but I knew that if I didn't get to you first, you'd be dead or married to a monster. I gave you a choice, Elena, a choice you never had before." "A choice between 2 monsters," she spat. "My father says the drive is poisoned. He says if you use it, it will destroy the Morettis." Dante looked at the drive in his hand. A dark, thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Your father was a master of the poisoned pill strategy. He probably isn't lying, but he forgot one thing. He walked toward her, and Elena didn't back away. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw just as it had in the villa. "I don't want the Vane Empire anymore, Elena," he whispered. "I have the only part of it that matters. The choice of the sparrow." The sirens were very close now. Blue and red lights were reflected in the smoke above the trees. Dante took the drive and, without a second thought, tossed it into the tall, dry grass near the burning edge of the estate. Elena gasped. "What are you doing? That's everything. Your family's legacy, the power you fought for." "It's a chain," Dante said, his eyes never leaving hers. "As long as that drive exists, you're an asset and I'm a handler. I'm tired of the game, Elena. I'm tired of being the man my father made me." He held out his hand. "The car is waiting. We have passports, a plane in Biggin Hill, and a world that thinks Elena Vane died in that fire tonight. We can go anywhere. We can be anyone." Elena looked at his hand. She looked at her father's body, cooling in the mud, and she looked at the fire that was consuming her past. She realized then that Julian Vane had been right about one thing. She was a storm, but a storm doesn't follow a path laid out by others. A storm carves its own way. "I'm not going with you as Lena," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I know," Dante smiled, and this time it was a genuine, weary expression. "Who are you then?" Eleanor reached up and pulled the silver mask from her face, letting it fall into the mud beside her father. She looked at the fire, then back at Dante. "I'm the one who survived the Vanes and the Morettis," she said. "And if you want me to get in that car, you're going to have to stop calling me a sparrow." The departure. They walked back to the SUV as the first fire engines roared up the driveway of the manor. The night was a cacophony of shouting men, crashing timber, and the roar of the blaze. As they drove away, leaving the carnage behind, Eleanor didn't look back. She sat in the front seat this time, her hand resting on the dashboard. The city of London began to shrink in the rearview mirror, a glittering, treacherous jewel that she had finally escaped. "Where to?" Dante asked as they hit the motorway. Elena looked at the horizon where the first faint line of dawn was beginning to break through the clouds. "Somewhere without glass walls," she said. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the world would reel from the Vane massacre. The headlines would speak of a gang war, of a tragic heiress lost to the flames, and of a power vacuum that was destabilizing the European underworld. The Volkovs were hunted down one by one, their secrets laid bare by the digital ghost virus that Elena had released before leaving the vault. The Moretti patriarch waited in Geneva for a drive that would never arrive, eventually realizing that his son had gone rogue. But in a small coastal town in the south of France, two people sat at a cafe overlooking the Mediterranean. They didn't look like monsters or royalty. They looked like two people who had finally learned how to breathe. Elena Vane sipped her coffee, the warmth of the sun on her face. She had a new name, a new life, and a heart that was no longer made of glass. Beside her, Dante was reading a book, a real book, not a dossier or a blueprint. The fall of Julian Vane hadn't just been the end of a man, it had been the birth of a woman. The sparrow had flown through the storm, and on the other side, she had found that the sky was much bigger than she had ever imagined. The unholy pact was gone. In its place was something much more terrifying and much more beautiful, a blank page. And as Eleanor looked at the blue expanse of the sea, she realized she finally knew how to write her own story. The lion was dead, the sparrow was gone, and the storm had finally found its peace. The Volkovs were hunted down one by one, their secrets laid bare by the digital ghost virus that Elena had released before leaving the vault. The Moretti patriarch waited in Geneva for a drive that would never arrive, eventually realizing that his son had gone rogue. But in a small, coastal town in the south of France, two people sat at a cafe overlooking the Mediterranean. They didn't look like monsters or royalty. They looked like two people who had finally learned how to breathe. Elena Vane sipped her coffee, the warmth of the sun on her face. She had a new name, a new life, and a heart that was no longer made of glass. Beside her, Dante was reading a book. A real book, not a dossier or a blueprint. The fall of Julian Vane hadn't just been the end of a man. It had been the birth of a woman. The sparrow had flown through the storm, and on the other side, she had found that the sky was much bigger than she had ever imagined. The unholy pact was gone. In its place was something much more terrifying and much more beautiful, a blank page. And as Eleanor looked at the blue expanse of the sea, she realized she finally knew how to write her own story. The lion was dead, the sparrow was gone, and the storm had finally found its peace. Chapter 10. The Roots of the Mountain. The transition from the scorched earth of London to the limestone peaks of the Swiss Alps was more than a change in geography. It was a migration of the soul. 3 years had passed since the night the Vane Manor became a pyre. In the world of the Syndicate, 3 years was an eternity, long enough for empires to be forgotten, for names to fade into urban legend, and for blood to finally stop staining the hands of those who had escaped. Elena stood on the wraparound terrace of their villa, a structure of warm wood and local stone that seemed to grow directly out of the mountainside. Below her, Lake Geneva stretched out like a sheet of hammered silver, reflecting the pale, crystalline light of a January morning. In London, winter had been a shroud of grey slush and bitter rain. Here, winter was a cathedral of white. The air was so thin and pure it felt like drinking from a glacier. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite. It purified. The death of the sparrow. Elena leaned against the cedar railing, her fingers tracing the faint, jagged scar on her palm. The only physical remains of her flight through the briars in London. She was no longer Lena Miller, the terrified ghost, nor was she the sparrow, the lethal apprentice. She had become someone else entirely. Her hair had grown long again, a river of natural gold that she wore loose, unburdened by the dyes of her past. Her wardrobe was no longer a collection of disguises, but a reflection of a woman who had nothing left to hide. She wore a heavy cream-coloured cashmere sweater and simple leggings, her feet bare on the heated wood of the deck. She thought back to the first year in the mountains. It had been the hardest. The silence of the Alps had been deafening. Without the constant hum of paranoia, without the need to check every shadow for a Volkov blade or a Vane tracker, she had felt hollow. She had spent months waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a pistol that was no longer under her pillow. It was Dante who had taught her how to live in the quiet. He had been patient, a steady mountain of a man who never asked her to be anything other than what she was in that moment. He had dismantled the Moretti Empire with the same cold efficiency he had used to destroy the Vanes, transitioning their vast wealth into legitimate ventures. Renewable energy, medical research, and alpine conservation. He had kept his promise. He had given her freedom, and then he had spent 3 years proving he wouldn't use it as a leash. The architect of peace. The eggs are getting cold and the dog is starting to eye your toast. The voice was low, resonant, and carried a touch of that dry wit she had grown to love. Elena turned to see Dante standing in the doorway. He looked younger than he had in London. The sharp, predatory edge of his features had softened, replaced by a calm strength. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, a far cry from the bespoke armor of his past. Beside him sat Bruno, a massive Bernese mountain dog they had adopted a year ago. Bruno thumped his tail against the floor, his tongue lolling out in a goofy grin. "I was just thinking about the trees," Elena said, gesturing toward the skeletal pines that clung to the cliffs above them. "I used to think they were dead in the winter, stripped down and empty." Dante walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth seeping through her sweater. "And now? Now I know they're just waiting," she whispered. "The roots go deeper than the frost. They aren't going anywhere. They've finally found a place where the wind can't pull them up." Dante squeezed her gently. "That makes two of us." The morning of truth. They sat at the heavy oak table in the kitchen, the sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The breakfast was simple: farm-fresh eggs, crusty bread, and coffee that smelled of hazelnut. It was a domesticity that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. As Eleanor reached for the coffee pot, her hand brushed against a folder Dante had left on the table. It was embossed with a clean, modern logo: the Vaughan Moretti Foundation. "The last of the London properties was sold yesterday," Dante said, watching her carefully. "The funds have been transferred to the Sanctuary Project in the Jura. The Vane name is officially associated with the protection of life now, Eleanor, not the taking of it." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of her father, Julian, and the way he had looked in the mud, a man who believed power was the only legacy. She realized now that she had done something he never could. She had redeemed the name. "Thank you, Dante," she said softly. "Don't thank me," he replied, his green eyes intense. "You were the one who had the courage to stop running. I just provided the mountain." The new life. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm. They walked Bruno through the snow-dusted forest, their boots crunching in unison. They talked about the future, not the tactical, high-stakes future of the syndicate, but the small, beautiful future of a life lived in the light. "I've been thinking about the guest wing," Elena said as they reached a clearing that looked out over the valley. "I want to turn it into an art studio. I want to start building again. Not blueprints for heists, but real things. Sculptures. Architecture." Dante stopped and looked at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "I think the mountain has been waiting for you to start building on it." But there was something else in his gaze, a flickering hesitation she hadn't seen in years. He took her hands in his thumbs rubbing circles over her knuckles. "Eleanor," he began, his voice dropping to a lower register. "There's one more thing, a reason why I've been so insistent on finishing the Foundation's paperwork this week." Elena's heart skipped a beat. For a split second, the old paranoia flared. Is it a threat? Did someone find us? But then she saw the tenderness in his eyes and the fear evaporated. "What is it?" Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wooden box. It wasn't velvet, it was carved from the same cedar as their home. He opened it to reveal a ring. It wasn't a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, like the one Volkov would have forced on her. It was a simple band of hammered gold, set with a single, deep green emerald that matched his eyes. "I've spent my whole life taking things," Dante said, his voice roughening with emotion. "Contracts, territories, lives. But 3 years ago, I met a girl who showed me that the only thing worth having is the thing that's given freely." He went down on one knee in the pristine snow. Bruno sat beside him, looking uncharacteristically solemn. "Eleanor Vane, or Lena, or whoever you choose to be today. Will you stay? Not because you're hiding, not because of a pact, but because this is where you belong." Elena looked at the man who had been her kidnapper, her mentor, her protector, and finally, her equal. She looked at the ring, which didn't look like a shackle. It looked like a root. "Yes," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I'm done waiting for my life to begin, Dante. I'm ready to stay." The rooted heart. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Elena stood once more on the terrace. The ring was heavy and warm on her finger. She looked at the bare January trees. She used to call them empty. She used to see them as victims of the season, stripped of their beauty and left to shiver in the cold. But she was wrong. They weren't empty. They were concentrated. They were holding their strength in their hearts deep beneath the soil, waiting for the exact moment when the world would ask them to bloom again. "My name is Elena," she whispered to the wind. She thought of the 9 years of her life that had been defined by flight: Zurich, Barcelona, Geneva, London, and back again. She thought of the walls she had built and called independence. She thought of the loneliness she had mistaken for safety. Dante stepped out onto the terrace, holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. He handed her one and leaned his back against the railing, watching her with a look of quiet contentment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking that standing still isn't always surrender," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Maybe sometimes it's what happens when you've finally found the place where you were meant to grow." The January sky was vast and indifferent, but beneath the cold, the roots were holding on. The veins were a memory. The Morettis were a legacy of the past. There was only the mountain, the lake, and the 2 people who had survived the fire to find the frost. Elena wrapped her arms around Dante's neck, the steam from the tea rising between them like a prayer. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling the snow into delicate white ghosts. But the villa didn't shake. It was anchored to the stone. She was no longer a sparrow in a storm. She was the mountain itself. And for the first time in her life, Elena was not afraid of the spring. She was ready to bloom.